When most people watch the World Cup, they see football. They see goals. They see celebrations. They see heartbreak. They see nations coming together for the biggest tournament on earth. And that's exactly what FIFA wants you to see. Because behind every goal, behind every ticket, behind every sponsorship board, behind every sold-out stadium, there is something else operating in the background. A business machine so large that it generates more money than the annual economy of some countries. Think about that. Not a football tournament, not a sports competition, a financial machine. And World Cup 2026 may become the biggest version of that machine we have ever seen. The strange thing is that most fans never notice it, because football is designed to be emotional. You remember the winning goal. You remember the upset. You remember the penalty shootout. You don't remember the broadcasting contract. You don't remember the sponsorship agreement. You don't remember the hospitality package sold to a corporation for thousands of dollars. But FIFA certainly does. Because while billions of people watch the football, FIFA watches the numbers. And the numbers behind World Cup 2026 are staggering. Before we go any further, I've got a question for you. Do you think the World Cup is still primarily about football? Or has it become more about business? Let me know in the comments, because by the end of this video, I think a lot of people might change their minds. Now let's follow the money. Because once you do, the World Cup starts looking very different. Most football fans assume FIFA makes money from tickets. And that's true. But tickets are actually only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real money comes from something most supporters never see: broadcasting rights. Every 4 years, television networks and streaming platforms around the world compete for access to the World Cup. Why? Because the World Cup remains one of the few events capable of attracting billions of viewers simultaneously. That audience is priceless, and broadcasters are willing to pay extraordinary amounts to reach it. During the 2019 to 2022 cycle, which included the Qatar World Cup, FIFA generated approximately $7.57 billion in total revenue. Let that number sink in for a second. $7.57 billion. And more than 83% of that revenue came directly from the World Cup itself, not youth tournaments, not development programs. The World Cup, one tournament, 1 month, one global audience. The single biggest contributor was broadcasting rights, generating roughly $3.6 billion, almost half of FIFA's total revenue. And that was before expansion. Because World Cup 2026 isn't following the old model. It's following a much bigger one, a model built around growth. Or, depending on who you ask, a model built around monetization. For the 2023 to 2026 cycle, FIFA is targeting approximately $13 billion in revenue. Some projections even place the figure closer to $14 billion. In other words, almost double the revenue, double the commercial value, double the opportunity. And that raises a very important question. How exactly does FIFA plan to make that much money? The answer begins with a number, 48. Because for the first time in history, the World Cup now includes 48 teams instead of 32. Officially, the explanation is simple. More nations, more representation, more opportunities. And to be fair, there is truth in that argument. Countries that previously had almost no realistic chance of qualifying can now dream again. Africa receives more places. Asia receives more places. CONCACAF receives more places. Millions of new supporters become invested. That is a genuine benefit. But every major decision has multiple consequences. And this one has a financial consequence that is impossible to ignore. More teams mean more matches. More matches mean more tickets. More matches mean more television inventory. More matches mean more sponsorship opportunities. More matches mean more advertising opportunities. More matches mean more hospitality packages. More matches mean more revenue. A lot more revenue. The old World Cup format contained 64 matches. The new format contains 104. Think about that. 40 additional matches. 40 additional commercial events. 40 additional opportunities to sell advertising, sponsorship exposure, hospitality experiences, broadcasting packages, and premium products. Suddenly, the expansion starts looking very different. Supporters see more football. Businesses see more inventory. And FIFA sees both. Critics argue that this is the real reason expansion happened. Not football development, not inclusivity. Revenue, the counter-argument, of course, is that both things can be true at the same time. More teams genuinely help global football, and more teams genuinely help FIFA's finances. The debate isn't whether expansion creates money. It clearly does. The debate is whether money became the primary motivation. And that's where things become more complicated. Because once you start looking beyond broadcasting and expansion, another side of the World Cup business begins to appear. The side most supporters never experience. Hospitality, luxury, VIP access, exclusive experiences. Because while millions of supporters fight for ordinary tickets, another group experiences an entirely different World Cup, a much more expensive one, and much more profitable. Imagine arriving at the stadium through a private entrance, premium seating, fine dining, exclusive lounges, corporate entertainment, personal service, luxury experiences designed specifically for wealthy clients and major corporations. This isn't a small niche. This is one of FIFA's fastest-growing revenue streams. Some hospitality packages start around $1,000 per person for a single match. Others cost several thousand. Follow Your Team packages can easily reach $8,000 to $10,000, and that's before travel and accommodation. For ordinary supporters, those prices sound ridiculous. For corporations, they're a business expense. For FIFA, they're a gold mine, because hospitality operates on a simple principle: sell fewer products, make much larger margins. At the Qatar World Cup, hospitality generated approximately $243 million. For World Cup 2026, that number is expected to rise significantly. Why? Because North America already has one of the most mature premium sports markets in the world. The NFL understands it. The NBA understands it. Major League Baseball understands it. And now FIFA wants a larger piece of that market too, which leads us directly to another controversy. Because while corporations are buying luxury experiences, ordinary supporters are increasingly asking a different question. Why is attending the World Cup becoming so expensive? And that's where one of the most controversial business decisions of World Cup 2026 enters the story: dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing sounds harmless. In fact, if you've ever booked a flight or a hotel, you've probably encountered it before. Prices rise when demand increases. Prices fall when demand drops. Simple, at least in theory. But many supporters argue that football isn't supposed to work like airline tickets, because football supporters don't choose when demand happens. The biggest matches will always attract the biggest crowds. The biggest nations will always attract the biggest crowds. And the World Cup final will always attract the biggest crowd, which means one thing: prices almost always move in one direction, up. For World Cup 2026, FIFA fully embraced dynamic pricing, and almost immediately, criticism followed. Supporters reported joining ticket queues only to discover prices had changed by the time they reached checkout. Others watched ticket prices rise dramatically as demand increased. Popular matches that initially appeared affordable suddenly became hundreds of dollars more expensive. Some reached four figures. Others went even higher. And that's before accommodation, before flights, before transportation, before food, before everything else. The result? For many supporters, attending the World Cup started feeling less like a football trip and more like a luxury purchase. And perhaps nowhere is that frustration more visible than in comparison with previous tournaments. Many supporters have argued that World Cup 2026 is becoming one of the most expensive World Cups ever staged, not because of one individual cost, but because every cost seems to be increasing simultaneously. Flights, hotels, transportation, tickets, food, everything. The irony is difficult to ignore. This is supposed to be the most inclusive World Cup in history. 48 nations, more supporters, more representation. Yet many ordinary fans feel increasingly excluded from the experience. And that leads directly to another layer of the business: the sponsors. Because if broadcasting is FIFA's biggest source of revenue, sponsorship is not far behind. and the scale is enormous. Every time you see a logo on a World Cup advertising board, every time you see a sponsor integrated into a broadcast, every time you see a branded fan experience, you're seeing part of a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem. Some of the world's biggest companies compete aggressively for these partnerships, not because they love football, because they love attention. And there is no larger audience in sports. Adidas, Coca-Cola, Visa, Hyundai, Qatar Airways, Lenovo, Budweiser, McDonald's, Hisense, Bank of America, and many others. Each partnership represents access to billions of viewers. Each partnership represents global exposure. And each partnership represents enormous revenue for FIFA. By the end of the current cycle, sponsorship and marketing revenue is expected to exceed $2.7 billion. Think about that. Almost $3 billion from companies simply wanting their brands associated with the World Cup. And World Cup expansion makes those partnerships even more valuable because more matches create more exposure. More exposure creates more impressions. More impressions create more value, which creates more money. The cycle keeps feeding itself. And then there's another development that has attracted increasing attention: Saudi investment. Over the last several years, Saudi Arabia has become one of the most influential financial forces in world sport. Football clubs, boxing, Formula One, golf, major sponsorship agreements. The strategy is impossible to ignore, and World Cup partnerships have become part of that conversation. Supporters, journalists, and analysts continue debating what these investments mean for football. Some view them as opportunities for growth. Others view them as attempts to gain influence through sport. Either way, the financial power involved is extraordinary, and FIFA has welcomed much of it, because at the end of the day, investment fuels revenue, and revenue fuels expansion. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Because if you've watched this far, it would be easy to conclude that FIFA only cares about money. And that wouldn't be entirely fair, because there is a counterargument, a strong one FIFA has repeated for years. The organization argues that revenue isn't the goal. Revenue is the tool. The argument goes like this: the more money the World Cup generates, the more money FIFA can distribute across global football, development programs, youth football, women's football, infrastructure, coaching education, grassroots investment, member associations, prize money. All of it requires funding, and funding requires revenue. In many parts of the world, FIFA money plays a significant role in football development. Without that support, some federations would struggle to grow the game. That's an important point, and it's one critics sometimes overlook. Because commercial success and football development are not mutually exclusive. The World Cup can generate billions, and those billions can still help football grow. The real question is balance. How much commercialization is too much? How much expansion is too much? How much monetization is too much? Because eventually every sporting event reaches a point where supporters start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about priorities. Questions about identity. Questions about purpose. And World Cup 2026 may be approaching that moment. Not because the football is failing. The football remains extraordinary. Not because supporters are losing interest. Global interest remains enormous. But because more supporters are starting to notice the machinery behind the tournament. The machinery that turns football into business. And once you notice it, it's difficult to stop seeing it. The luxury packages. The dynamic pricing. The sponsorship activations, the premium experiences, the expansion strategies, the revenue targets, the broadcasting battles. Suddenly you realize something. The World Cup isn't just football anymore. It's one of the largest commercial events on the planet. And perhaps it always was. The difference is that today, the business side is harder to hide because supporters are more informed, more connected, more aware. They can see the numbers. They can see the prices, they can see the decisions, and they can draw their own conclusions. Which brings us back to the central question. Is football growing? Or is the business growing faster than football? Because that's a debate sitting underneath almost every major World Cup conversation. The debate about ticket prices, the debate about expansion, the debate about sponsorships, the debate about accessibility, the debate about who the tournament is really for. FIFA would argue the answer is everyone. Critics increasingly argue the answer is changing. And maybe that's why World Cup 2026 feels so important. Not because it will determine who wins the trophy, but because it may determine what the World Cup becomes in the future. A bigger tournament, a richer tournament, a more global tournament. Those things are almost certain. The question is whether it remains a tournament ordinary supporters can still recognize as their own. Because football has always belonged to more than corporations, more than broadcasters, more than sponsors. It belongs to supporters, the people who save money for years to attend one match, the families who build memories around the tournament, the communities that stop everything to watch their nation play. Without those people, there is no World Cup. There is only a business. And that's the question FIFA may eventually have to answer. Not how much money the World Cup can generate, but how much football it can preserve while generating it. Because the World Cup has become a billion-dollar business. Nobody disputes that anymore. The real question is whether it can remain football's greatest celebration at the same time. And that may be the most important match FIFA faces in the years ahead.